Hello, in this video we're going to take a look at some of the gear that we use to fly FPV or first person view, and of course this is not necessary to fly the quadcopter, this is only necessary if you actually want to fly FPV. And the connections for these is basically what we're going to be looking at here, and it's a lot simpler than some of the other things that we've looked at in those previous videos, so I don't think it should take too long. So it's mostly just to give you a quick idea of how things connect up, and we'll look at some example pieces of equipment. So let's start with this. This is a camera, and the camera piece on lens on the front, and a bunch of circuit boardy stuff on there. And this is getting a little bit dated now. You're probably not going to find too many of these around. I bought this almost a year and a half ago now, and you can still buy them, but I probably wouldn't recommend it because you've got all this stuff at the back that's exposed, and you have to try and sort of keep it protected and hope that water doesn't splash on it when you crash in wet grass and so on. So you're probably much more likely to be wanting to get something like this, which is pretty much the same thing functionality wise. Actually this one has a few more features which I'll get to a little bit later, but the main point about this is that it's in this much easier to protect case, and you don't have to worry too much about crashing with this camera. As far as the connections go on here, you can see I've got this wire which is going to be used to connect to it in a minute, and there's only three things on it, and hopefully from the previous videos you can have a pretty good guess as to what the black and the red ones are for. But just in case you can't, let's look at this. Whoops, upside down. So down there in the bottom right we have two plugs that we can connect, J1 and J2. And they have some descriptions there. So J1 is on-screen display and ground. Always need two wires minimum to connect a circuit, remember. And over there for J2 we have video, ground and power. So it's video, ground and power. So obviously the third wire here is for the video signal. And this is what's known as an analog signal. So it's similar to PWM in a way, in that it's using timing. It measures time and the way the voltage changes to pass the video signal through. And on one wire there's only going to be video coming through on the wire. So we typically don't fly with audio because there's not really too much to hear. All you can hear is the noise of the propellers, and that sounds pretty terrible. But some people do actually put a microphone on the quadcopter. They like to hear how the motors are revving and something or other. I don't do that myself, but if you want to try that, it can perhaps be useful. Now over here I have a little monitor, and this is an analog video monitor. So it knows how to display the analog signal that's going to be coming through this wire. And over this side here I've got this connected to a power supply, and this yellow plug is for the incoming video signal. And I've got this connected over on this end with a few of these little connectors that I'm going to use. And the red one, or well, it's red going into blue, this is the video signal wire. So I'm going to plug that into the yellow one on here. So that's going to connect up the signal for the monitor. And then I have these two which are actually connected together. These are my ground pins, and I'm going to need two of them because, as you should remember from one of those previous videos, every time you connect up two circuits and you expect them to communicate with each other, you need to have a ground, give them a common ground reference. So I'm using these wires connected at this point to make sure that the ground that I plug into the camera and the ground that I'm going to plug into the ground connected to the camera is connected to the ground going through to the monitor already. And actually I just remembered I need this one to plug into the battery. That's what that's for. But the point is that you always need to have a common ground. So this pin I'm going to put into the ground on this LiPo battery. Like that. And then that leaves us with one plug that we need to connect still, which is the red one on there. So I'm going to plug that using this other connector into one of the other pins on the LiPo balance plug. I'll put it right on the top, so that'll give us about 12 volts for this particular LiPo. And we can see on this camera somewhere it actually excuse me, handles 5 to 17 volts there, so it's safe to use this LiPo battery there. Now nothing happened because I still haven't plugged this part into the camera, so let me do that. And then we should see something on the screen when we do that. Okay, so hopefully you can see that there. And you can see my finger moving. So that's it really. So in between the camera and the screen we need to have a video transmitter and a video receiver, and this is a couple of examples here. The receiver that I'm looking at is pretty dated now. I don't think anybody's using this kind of receiver anymore. But the transmitter is probably still pretty common. This is the one that I'm going to be using on one of my builds at least, maybe even both of them. So let's just have a quick look at the connections that are on this one, and they are labeled there: ground, audio, video, ground, and then power, 7 to 24 volts. And those labels are referring of course to this plug here on the back. So there's no labels there, that's why they've printed the label on this side. And so for connecting up this camera where we had well, basically the important connections between the camera and the video transmitter are ground and the video signal. So we need ground, we can use either of these grounds, and then video, which should be black and a yellow on here. Looks like one of the grounds is actually, one of the grounds is blue. Anyway, sorry. So we'd have one of the grounds and then video, bringing the signal in from the camera. That's going to be absolutely necessary. We don't necessarily need to connect the powers together, but in most cases it's kind of convenient to connect the wire coming from the camera together with the wire that's going into the video transmitter, and then connect them together to the battery, because they can both use battery power. So this was able to take 17 volts, and this one can take 24 volts, so it should be safe to power these two things directly from the LiPo battery, and they don't need to have any voltage regulator. But as I mentioned, if you have an older camera, I don't think those older cameras are around too much, but if you have an older camera that does require a limited voltage, say 12 volts in most cases, then you'll need to use one of these voltage regulator kind of things that can provide the 12 volts, for example this one, and power the camera from 12 volts. And down on the ground we would have the receiver and the screen, and I'll just quickly look at this. This is a little bit of a history lesson now, I guess, because this kind of receiver is just looking really old. But just to look at the connections, we have 12 volts power going in there, and you can get little special plugs that go in there for that, and then it can actually have a video output to 2 separate screens, so you could connect this up to a goggles, and you could connect one of them up to a video recording thing if you wanted to record your video while you're flying as well. And then there's an antenna. Oh, of course there's also an antenna on the transmitter as well. So these some of these antennas have slightly different connections, so you have to make sure you get the right antenna for them. See, one has a pin in the middle on the right and the other one doesn't, and you just got to make sure you get the right connection for the antenna that you plug in. And there's nothing else on this, but when you power it up you'll be able to see which video channel you are receiving on there, so you can select different channels. And over on here, this is looking a little bit dated now too, but you can set these switches in a special way, and that will allow you to select which channel you want to broadcast on. And probably should also mention the frequency that these video transmitters are typically using is 5.8 gigahertz, which is what the 5.8G means there. And this is, in many countries, this is a license-free band that you can just use, but in some countries there are limits on how much power you can use. For example, this one is a 200 milliwatt transmitter. It's okay for me to use this here in New Zealand, but some countries, especially in Europe, I think Germany is one, you are limited to around 25 milliwatts, so it's okay to use for low power transmitters only. So this one you probably couldn't use that as is in Germany. I think it's Germany, maybe other countries as well. And the reason for that is that these transmitters are not frequency hopping. If you remember the transmitters that we saw, the receivers that we saw in the radio, these 2.4 gigahertz systems like this, they are frequency hopping, which means that the frequency always changing a little bit all the time, and by that system that allows many different transmitters and receivers to all function in the same area without interfering with each other. But this 5.8 gigahertz analog video transmission is not frequency hopping. So you are going to be broadcasting on one single frequency the whole time. So it's a little bit more like the radio station in your car that just stays on one frequency all the time. And that means that if somebody else comes on that frequency with you, you're going to be interfering with them and they're going to be interfering with you, and neither of you are going to have a good picture. So whatever they're doing on their system, they're not going to be able to do it, and you're not going to be able to see what you're flying properly. So that's the reason that we have a channel selection on here, and this particular video transmitter is able to choose between 40 different frequencies. So it's not hopping between them, it's just going to be stuck on one frequency all the time, depending on the way that you've set up these switches there. And this one here, same thing, 5.8 gigahertz frequency, and then you'll choose the channel that you want to listen to on there. This is probably a good time to clarify what is meant by the frequencies that these things use, because as we saw in the receiver video where we had the 2.4 gigahertz frequency, what that actually meant was that the 2.4 gigahertz was kind of the center of the general area of frequency that's used, and the actual frequency that's used is something a little bit different to 5.8, or something close to 5.8 gigahertz. So going back to our example where we had a car radio and it was set to 87.5 megahertz, the frequencies that we're using are way higher than 87. They are 5,740, for example. So it's a much higher frequency. And as I mentioned in the other video, frequency is related to the distance that the signal will travel, and as the frequency gets higher and higher, the distance that the signal will travel gets lower. So generally the 2.4 gigahertz radio systems that we looked at for the radio control will be able to go further than the 5.8 gigahertz systems. But these can still go, up to, I've used a 200 milliwatt system up to about 2 kilometers, and as long as you have a decent set of antennas and decent transmitter and receiver, it can go pretty good distances. Anyway, so the actual frequencies that these use are shown in this chart, and they are, for example, 5,740, 5,760. So you can see that in this band they're all separated by about 20 megahertz. So this sort of is similar to how you would choose the stations on your car radio. You tune into one, and then you just leave it there. You don't frequency hop and change any frequencies. You just leave it on one. And then there's another system which uses 5,645 megahertz, and then 5,665, and so on. And it's sort of I'm not really sure how these all came about, but you can see that they are all sort of were 58. Here's 5.8 gigahertz exactly. So this is kind of in the middle of this range of frequencies. And yeah, like I say, I don't know how these came about, but they're named BOSCAM B, BOSCAM A. So anyway, these sets of frequencies are grouped into something called bands, or frames. Sometimes they're called frames, sometimes they're called bands. And this would be called, for example, band E, band B, band A, and they're all slightly different. But you can see that they're fairly close sometimes. So over here we've got 5752, 5745. These are only 7 megahertz apart. So if you were flying on this channel and your friend was flying on this one here, these are pretty close enough to the point that you might actually get some interference from his video transmitter, from his quadcopter, and he might get some interference from you. And nobody likes that, so if you were flying with just the two of you, you'd maybe choose this one, and you tell him to choose, say, this other one down here. And because people like to fly together and have fun and race their quadcopters and so on, this band called race band came about fairly recently, and the idea of this is to separate these frequencies over this 5.8 gigahertz range and get them all as far apart from each other as possible. So instead of separating them just by 20 megahertz like this, they're separated by a good 50 or so megahertz between each one. So between the lowest one and the furthest one, they're really, really far apart from each other. And this is handy when you're having races with, say, typically races in organized events are between 4. Are they? I don't do much racing, but typically you have maybe 4 to 8 quadcopters at a time racing. And in that case, you would really want to use this thing called raceband. And I think these days, even when you're not in an organized race event, it's much more convenient to, when you go and meet up with your friends, just to say to them, which channel are you using? And if you just say raceband 1, it's a lot easier than saying Boscam B channel 3 or something like that, because then you're sort of talking about this sort of confusing mess up here, and I certainly haven't memorized this stuff, and I don't know anybody else who has either. So raceband has become quite a convenient standard to use. So depending on the type of video transmitter you have, you're going to have to choose which one of these frames and which channel within the frame. So the frames are the rows, and then channels are these little pyramid thingies. You're going to have to choose the frequency and the channel, or the frame and the channel, in some way. And on this example video transmitter that I was looking at earlier, we have these little switches there. And for this one, you would choose the channel and the frame by putting those switches in a certain position. So, for example, to choose raceband, in this case, it's kind of annoying how these names are all a little bit different. So in this case, I think raceband is this one here, frame 5, and it's also called G. The naming is really messed up. I don't know why we couldn't have had a simpler system for naming, but I'm pretty sure this one here is raceband. And then if I wanted to say be raceband channel 3, I would then put the rest of my switches to this position. So to be honest, it's kind of a pain in the ass to try and memorize how these switches work, and I haven't really memorized this too well. So I actually printed out this table, and I carry this around with me to make sure I can get the right channel when I need to. Now, because this is such a pain in the ass to organize, we're starting to see more modern transmitters coming out where you don't need to fiddle with those little dip switches. You can see which channel you're currently using by this LED display, and you can change the frame and the channel by using this button. Like you do a short press to change the channel and a long press to change the frame, or something like that usually would be the case. There's just one drawback with this system though, and that is that you have to turn this on in order to change the channel, and when you turn it on, it's going to be transmitting already. So if you are already on a channel, the same channel as your friend, and he's up in the air flying, as soon as you turn this on, it's going to interfere with him. So for that reason, I kind of like these older systems in that respect, so that's why I still use this one most of the time. As far as antennas go, there are a few different types of them, a couple of basic ones here, but by far the most commonly used type is this one here. And the reason for that is that it gives a good signal in various orientations. So no matter which way your quadcopter is facing, you should get a pretty decent signal with this antenna, as opposed to something like this, which actually has weaker spots in various directions. So if you remember from one of those previous videos, when we have a current flowing through a wire, basically what's inside here is just a little piece of straight wire, and it's cut to a specific length to resonate with the 5.8 gigahertz frequency that is being switched off and on, very roughly speaking. It's switching, and it's setting up a electromagnetic field around that wire, like in a sort of a circle around it, and it's sort of changing it at that 5.8 gigahertz frequency. And what that does is it sets up a fairly strong signal coming out on the sides of the antenna. So this, if you can imagine this as a circle, my hand's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger like that. So in that direction it's a good signal, but right out the end of the antenna there's going to be a very weak spot, or a null as it's called in radio terms. And I might actually have to make another video to sort of talk about this stuff in a bit more detail later on, because there's quite a bit to it and it's quite complex. So yeah, I'm not sure if I'll do that, but we'll see. But the point is that if you happen to be flying around and this part of the antenna is pointing directly at you down on the ground, it means that you're not going to get a very good signal in that orientation. but we like to fly our quadcopters in lots of different orientations and turn them around and stuff, so that's where an antenna like this comes in, because in almost every orientation that you can get it, it's still going to have a piece of wire like this that's radiating that electromagnetic energy out in sort of roughly in your direction, no matter where you are. So these are a lot more popular, and of course these antennas will go on your receiver like that. Yeah, that's the right one. You've got to make sure you're matching these up, and it'll go on there. And in the case of a transmitter, the transmitter is actually going to be pumping quite a bit of power down through this line, in this case 200 milliwatts, and if you do not have an antenna on here, it's kind of funny how it works, but that antenna, the energy that gets pushed out this way actually sort of bounces back. Most of it will actually bounce back into the transmitter, and it can actually damage it. So again, this I think I might have to go over in future, but long story short, do not power up the video transmitter unless you have an antenna of the right kind connected to the antenna terminal like this. For a receiver, you don't really need to worry so much, because this is not, the receiver is just listening on this antenna connection. It's not pumping power through it. So you can power up a receiver with no antenna and you're not going to break it. Now, as I said, this receiver and stuff is a little bit dated now, and you don't really want to look at this. Well, you can, when you're first starting out with FPV, you'll probably feel a bit more comfortable just looking at a screen like this to do it, instead of having goggles stuck on your face. But the way things generally work is you will have some goggles, and all of that stuff that we just looked at is more commonly brought together into a much more convenient package like this. So there's a screen in there already, and a lens so that when the screen is held up close to your face you can still focus on it properly. And we have a receiver built inside, so there's one of these inside this box, and we have some selections here to find the channel. This one actually has a button to search through the channels automatically and find one where there's actually something happening, and then we have some power inputs there. And this one has 2 antenna terminals, so again it's like the diversity that we saw in the radio control receiver. It listens on both of these antennas, and whichever one happens to be strongest at any given time, it will choose that one, so you get the best signal. So you would have a second antenna stuck on there like that. Now, just going back to the onboard the quadcopter side of things for a minute, I just remembered I forgot to show one thing that I was going to show you. This is the OSD plug that we had there, and we'll have a look at what that is. By the way, everything that's on the quadcopter here for the video section, none of this needs to be connected to any of the other stuff that we saw. So the flight controller, the receiver, the ESCs, all of that is like a separate circuit. But usually we run everything off the same flight battery, so it's only the power coming from the battery is where they're connected. But if you wanted to, you could run it from a separate battery even, and the video stuff and the flight controller stuff could all be completely different. Anyway, so I've connected the camera back up, so we have this on the screen there, and this little plug here with a joystick has a connection with just 2 wires on it, and I can plug this into the connection that was labeled OSD on my camera, and this will let me modify some settings on the camera. Now this will depend on what brand, what make and model of camera you have. Not all cameras will have this plug. Most of them will, and pretty much everything that's made by this quite commonly used RunCam brand will pretty much have this feature. So once I have this connected, I can then use this little joystick thing to bring up some, I'll just zoom you down here a bit. So now we can see I can use this to change some settings. Backlight, day and night. What can we do that makes a difference? Brightness, here we go. So I can change the brightness. Well, that's not going to work. Anyway, so this is a quite useful thing that you can use to change settings on the camera. Oops, set that on. So OSD stands for on-screen display, and that's what we're looking at here. But this is something that exists in the camera's brain. So the camera has a fairly clever little brain of its own. And you may hear people talking about on-screen display referring to when you're flying FPV, you can see how fast you're going and how high you are and so on like that. That's a little bit different. That stuff is actually coming from the flight controller's brain. So there's two slightly different types of OSD. Oh, and speaking of different types, I was also going to show you a little bit more about this one. There's not really too much to show, but we'll just take a look at these connections because they're a little bit different. On the right hand side we can see that we have the ground and the OSD, so that's the same. You can use that little joystick thing on this camera just the same as we did with that one. And over there we have some slightly different stuff. We've actually got 5 pins on this one. So the top one is for voltage. This camera can actually use up to 36 volts, so you can use it with a much higher voltage battery. Then we've got ground and video. Those are the same as the other camera. This one actually has audio as well. So there's a little microphone in there, and you could connect this audio wire out to the, where is it? On this one, remember we had an audio wire there. That will be the green one, I think. And then that will send audio back down to the ground as well, so you can listen to the sounds coming from the quadcopter. And this camera is one of my favorites because it also has this connection here called VBAT. So this is the voltage of the battery. So you can connect a voltage there, and you would connect up the voltage from your flight battery, and then this will actually put on screen, say somewhere on the screen, maybe down in the left corner or the bottom right corner, wherever you want to put it. You can change the settings on this using the little joystick thingy, but it will display the voltage of the battery as you're flying, so you can always see how much battery you have left. So that's another type of OSD that you can use. Well, that's probably all that needs to be said for now. We'll need to come back and look at some of the finer points in the future. But I just thought before I finished I'd mention one other thing that you might be interested in when you're first starting out. These things are getting pretty cheap these days, so this is a very, very convenient way to get started with FPV because it's a camera and a video transmitter and antenna all in one. And this particular one was about $25, so they're sort of around that price mark. And they're quite easy to power. This one can be plugged into your receiver, so we've got ground and then a power. I think this one can go up to 17 volts, so from 5 to 17 volts. So I would plug this into my receiver pins on my quadcopter, and you can power it that way. And then the white one can be used to change the channels actually using your radio transmitter. But if you want to change the channels normally, you can do it using these buttons here. Why isn't this focusing? This will display the channel that you're viewing, and you can select it like this. So it's quite a bit more easy to use than the other transmitter that we saw as well. And it's very light, so you can just stick it onto something using a piece of double-sided tape like that, and it should stick on fairly well. And it's nice and easy to pull off your quadcopter and put onto a plane or a car or something else, and you immediately have an FPV set up on your car. And this particular one is 25 milliwatts, so it'll be legal in most countries. You can get these little cameras that go up to, I think some of them you can go up to 600 milliwatts with a little thing like this. But anyway, that's just something that you might want to consider when you're starting out. I certainly would probably, if I was doing everything again myself, I would be very tempted to just get something like this instead of going for a setup with a camera and transmitter and antenna all as separate modules. I would probably try one of these to start with because it's pretty cheap and very, very convenient for other purposes as well. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you next time.